before the death of Nelson Mandela, I hesitate to say. And then I looked on the front pages of all the British newspapers and indeed the Canadian newspapers, and I saw all the stories were about sexual scandals. And I was horrified and excited to see that sexuality still has the ability to scandalize not only the public, but our own sexuality to scandalize us. That there is always something scandalous about all sexuality, that somehow it's always beyond us, it's always a puzzle to us. And this really interests me as a writer, that there's something that always escapes. There's something that we can't control about ourselves. There's something we can't understand about ourselves. And that there is something that is absolutely necessary to us, which is our desire, which is our libido, you know. One of my sons, my youngest son, he really doesn't like to read. He claims that he can't read, you know. But when he really wants to know something, when he wants to read about football, he can really read about football. You know, I can see him in the corner. He's reading a magazine about football. He's really excited about it. So that I can see that our excitement is a real clue to our desire, to what we want. That there are moments in life when we feel really alive, when we really want something, when we feel that this is really important, when we feel that something really has meaning to us. And I think I feel like that in having certain conversations with certain friends, or being in love with somebody, or writing a book. And these are moments of real elevation and of importance. And there are, of course, other moments in our lives where it feels, you know, dull and there is nothing happening. And I'm really interested in excitement and pleasure. And what a problem excitement and pleasure really is for all of us. And so you might say, you have to have a character for whom their pleasure, their excitement is a real problem. And then an audience will really identify and see themselves in that. And then you have the clockwork of a plot that begins to work, or the clockwork of a disaster. And as I say, you see that on the front page of every newspaper. You find a politician, a very important man, usually a man, but not always a man, who's thrown everything away for no reason whatsoever except for love, sex, or passion. What a great idea, what a fantastically foolish, let's say, Laurel and Hardy thing to do. And there's something so beautiful about that, that a story like that could only make you want to be a writer. Or a politician, actually.
I'm also interested in the way that kids seem to increasingly elbow their way into these stories. And often in the space of a paragraph or so, the reader gets a sense of the tenderness and the hard work that it takes to be a parent. What makes being a parent rewarding, and would you recommend it?
Well, one of my sons is here, so I have to be very careful what I say. People say that my work is autobiographical, but I know my son will become enraged if I say anything that is too personal about him. But I have to say, I became a father when I was 38, and I think being a father made me a serious person. Because the children go to school and then they come home at a certain time, and in that window you then have to write. Usually if you're a writer, you think it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and then you spend the whole day messing around, and finally at 9 o'clock at night you think it's about time I started. When you've got kids, it really creates let's say, an emergency. You also then have to write. I was thinking, I've got to write to keep this house from falling down. That's a real good reason to write, you know. And I became responsible. I became responsible for these other people, and it seemed like a huge thing to me to actually, you know, not just write for fun, but to write for a living. I said one of my students said to me the other day. It was a beautiful question. She said to me, "How would I know?" She said. Professor Qureshi, I insist on being called Professor Qureshi. How would I know, Professor Qureshi, when I've become a writer? And I said, you'll know that you become a writer when someone pays for something you've written. I said, to me, this is the most important form of literary criticism that could possibly exist, is when someone writes a check and hands it to you for something you've written. I said, nothing F.R. Leavis could ever say would be as beautiful as that moment when somebody buys one of your books. And that sense that there really is a reader, that the reader has desire for your book, that there is a real relation between you and the reader, there's a real purpose between you and the reader going on. It seems to me that there's really something important and something really alive in that. So you can be sure that we writers are socialists at home but capitalists at heart.
What about writers who take the view that parenthood is antithetical to the enterprise? For instance, Naipaul, who said, each child you have is a book you don't write.
But that would be a mercy, wouldn't it, actually? That might be a mercy for the world. Funnily enough, I'll tell you the story I shouldn't tell you, but I will tell you, and I know, well, I said to Mr. Naipaul recently, I was sitting next to him, I didn't know what to say to him. I said, Mr. Naipaul, I said, you regret not having children. He said to me, not having children has been the only beautiful thing that's happened to me in my life. I thought that was such a great thing to say. That'll be on Twitter.
That sounds like a tragic life. I'm also struck by how prophetic some of these stories seem. And I wonder if you'd read a small passage from My Son the Fanatic, which, I remind you, was published in 1997, and long before urban terrorism became a fact of life in the United Kingdom and in India.
You know, I don't even remember this. This is going to be as new to me as it is to you. It's extraordinary when somebody asks you to read something from something you've written, because the one thing you don't want is to read your own work again or to have anybody reading it back to you. In a low, monotonous voice, the boy explained that Parvez had not, in fact, lived a good life. He had broken countless rules of the Quran. For instance, Parvez demanded, Ali hadn't needed time to think. As if he'd been waiting for this moment, he asked his father if he didn't relish pork pies. Well, Parvez couldn't deny that he loved crispy bacon smothered with mushrooms and mustard and sandwiched between slices of fried bread. In fact, he ate bacon for breakfast every morning. Ali then reminded Parvez that he'd ordered his own wife to cook pork sausages, saying to her, "You're not in the village now, this is England, we have to fit in." Parvez was so annoyed and perplexed by this attack that he called for more drink. "The problem is this," the boy said. He leaned across the table. For the first time that night, his eyes were alive. The son said, "You are too implicated in Western civilization." Parvez burped. He thought he was going to choke. "Implicated," he said, "but we live here." "The Western imperialists hate us. Materialists hate us," said Ali. "Papa, how can you love something which hates you?" "What is the answer then?" Parvez said miserably. "According to you." Ali addressed his father fluently, as if Parvez were a rowdy crowd that had to be quelled and convinced. "The law of Islam would rule the world," he said. "The skin of the infidel would burn off again and again. The Jews and the Christers would be routed. The West was a sink of hypocrites, adulterers, homosexuals, drug takers, and prostitutes." As Ali talked, Parvez looked out of the window as if to check they were still in the same country. "My people have taken enough," his son said. "If the persecution of us doesn't stop, there will be jihad. I and millions of others will gladly give our lives for the cause." "But why?" said Parvez. "For us," the boy said, "the reward will be in paradise." "Paradise?" Finally, as Parvez's eyes filled with tears, the boy urged him to mend his ways. "But how is that possible?" Parvez asked. "Pray," Ali said. "Pray beside me." Parvez called for the bill, and he ushered his boy out of the restaurant as soon as he was able to. He couldn't take any more. Ali sounded as if he'd swallowed somebody else's voice. On the way home, the boy sat in the back of the taxi as if he were a customer. "What has made you like this?" Parvez asked him, afraid that somehow he was to blame for this. "Is there a particular event which has influenced you?" "Living in this country," said the boy. "But I love England," Parvez said, watching his boy in the mirror. "They let you do almost anything here." "That is the problem," his son said.
Thank you. As we know that a very short story, actually, eventually became a movie. You've said you didn't really want to be a screenwriter, and yet you've written half a dozen screenplays. Is it more fun than writing a novel?
This was a short story, and when I'd finished it, I felt that I hadn't said it. I hadn't said enough. I thought it was so fascinating, this subject, to take a father and a son, and the son becomes a fundamentalist, and the father likes to drink, and indeed in the story falls in love with a prostitute. I felt I wanted to make it bigger, but I also wanted to make it for a bigger audience, for which in this case was British television. It was made by the BBC. And I wanted to work with other people. As Jeet knows, as most writers knows, it's really dull being a writer. It's very, very glamorous and really exciting and really boring. Sometimes you're sitting in front of a vast crowd like here, and sometimes you're just sitting in a room on your own with the door shut most of the time, trying to make up stories, which is an odd way to spend your day, your life, make a living. So I love to collaborate with other people. I love to collaborate with other people because they really mess you around, you know. They have much better ideas than you have. So when I'm working with other people, I get better ideas, which I can then take from them, and in a sense become joint ideas. So I write movies in order to be messed around really by other people, but messed around in a creative way. I've had fantastic actors in my films. I'm really grateful to the fact that they make your lines sound better than they look on the page, actually. If you've got Daniel Day-Lewis saying your words, you're really, as they say in England, quids in.
Your most recent film, The Weekend, was released last month. In it, an older couple returns to Paris for their wedding anniversary, but I'm guessing it's not a romantic comedy.
Well, it's about being married. They hate each other and there's no sex.
As someone says in the new book, no one has been truly married until they've committed adultery.
That book hasn't been published yet, but yes, thank you.
The question of sex in marriage and sex in marriage, why is this an important subject for cinema or literature?
I was talking to the director I usually work with, a guy called Roger Michel. He directed The Buddha Suburbia on TV, The Mother and Venus. And we were sitting around shooting the breeze, talking of ideas for movies we might do. And it occurred to us that normally when you see a couple in a movie having sex, they're normally having sex for the first time. And they're usually young. And then we got the brilliant and probably tragic idea of making a movie about a couple who are having sex, let's say, for the 3,000th time. How exciting is that as an idea? Can't you wait to see that? And we thought that most of the people that we know are married, or have been married, or indeed their parents were married, or come from marriages, that marriage in a sense is the central subject, you might say, of everybody's life. If they're not married, then they're on, Tinder, trying to get married. So we thought we'd make a film about people who are married, and what it's like to be married, and how you can only hate the people you love the most, and how terrible it is to look at your partner's eyes over breakfast and to see that they hate you. And what's that like, and what that does to you. And it seems to me to be, there's not enough of that in the cinema. And oddly enough, to my surprise, and clearly to your surprise, this film has done really well at the box office. It may or may not come to India. You can probably watch it on as a download eventually. It's quite an interesting idea, and it's a very simple idea, which is really just to take a very simple story of two people. You take two people, you put them in a room together, and you leave them there, and they talk to each other. And it's just a camera. And this is the most cheapest, the most simple form of filmmaking, but it's a very fundamental film of filmmaking, because you say, how can I make the story sustain? There's no noises, there's no bangs, there's nothing in outer space, there's no cars, there's nothing. It's just simple storytelling about this couple. And I think it's a rather beautiful idea, actually, and indeed a sympathetic idea.
But older people having sex isn't exactly movie blockbuster material. Yet your last 3 films have featured older characters. Why is the question of sex and aging become a kind of theme in your work?
First of all, because people live longer. And they're living for ages. And also they're copulating much longer, apparently. You know, people after 60, I'm nearly 60. I'm not speaking from personal experience, I hesitate to add, but you know, people are still copulating after 60. It's horrifying to think of it. I can see in my son's eyes the horror, the thought of a man or woman over 60 copulating. But in our film The Mother, we had a woman who was in her mid-60s, played by Annie Reid, and she gets to copulate with James Bond, with Daniel Craig, and she loved it. She loved every minute of it. And you could see that the possibilities of pleasure are expanding. And that there are new subjects for the cinema. And in fact, there is a whole audience of people who go and see films like The Exotic Marigold Hotel, who will go and see our film, Le Weekend, and whatever. And that these cinemas are really busy. They're really busy around midday. I found that for the Le Weekend, the most crowded part of the day was the 11:45 in the morning screening. They said, they rang me up and they said, well, it's been really busy, they said. The disabled lift's been in use all day today with your film. And I was so pleased. So it's fantastic. You can begin a writer as a 20-year-old punk, as I did, as a young kid, as an enfant terrible, you know, and then you can be a crazy old man like me and you can still be writing and it can still be exciting and still fun. It's a good job to be a writer. My father said to me, he said, Hanif, you shouldn't be a cricketer. He said, you should be a writer. It lasts much longer. So you see, Sachin Tendulkar has retired, but I'm still scoring.